I want you to picture this. I'm standing in a parking lot, staring at a tow truck backing up to my only car, my hands shaking. My 8-year-old daughter Maya sitting on the curb eating a granola bar like everything is completely fine. Because she trusts me to fix things. 5 different mechanics, 5 different dealerships, 5 different experts in their field had all told me the same thing in the same week. Your transmission is shot. You're looking at $4,000 minimum. Probably closer to 6. And honestly, at that mileage you might just want to think about buying something new. And I'm standing there, single dad, no savings account worth mentioning, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and the fridge from being embarrassing. Watching them strap my car to a chain, and I'm thinking, there has to be another way. There has to be someone left in this world who actually knows what they're doing and isn't just trying to take everything from me. So I want to ask you right now, before I even get into what happened next, would you have done what I did? Would you have trusted a stranger in a half-collapsed garage, on the wrong side of town with the only vehicle, standing between your family and total collapse? Tell me in the comments right now. Because by the end of this story, I think your answer is going to surprise even you. Let me back up to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding where I was in life at the time. My name is Derek. And about 3 years ago my life got completely rearranged in the kind of way that you never really see coming even when the signs are all there. My wife Rachel and I had been drifting apart for a couple of years, and when she finally sat me down and told me she was leaving, I thought the hardest part was going to be getting used to sleeping in a quiet house. I had no idea. What I did not understand in those early weeks was the total, grinding, mechanical weight of doing everything alone, every school pickup, every dentist appointment, every grocery run, every permission slip, every nightmare at 2 in the morning, every fever, every soccer practice, every school project that was due tomorrow. All of it, just me. I am not complaining about Maya. She is the single greatest thing that has ever happened to me, and I would walk through fire for her without hesitating. But I want you to understand the context here because the context matters enormously. I was already stretched so thin that when something big went wrong, there was no cushion, there was no margin, there was nothing. The car in question was a 2009 Honda CR-V with about 140,000 miles on it. I had bought it used 3 years before all of this started, and it had been reliable in that quiet, unspectacular way that good cars are. It got me to work. It got Maya to school. It held our bikes on the back when we went to the park, and I never thought much about it. Then one morning in early October I was merging onto the highway and the car just hesitated, not dramatically, just a little stutter, like it forgot what it was doing for half a second. I filed it away mentally and kept driving. 2 days later, same thing, a little worse. A week after that I was pulling into the parking lot at the grocery store and the transmission slipped so hard that Maya looked up from her book and said, "Daddy, is the car sick?" And I said, "No baby, the car is fine," and I felt my stomach drop to my shoes. I took it to the first place the next Saturday morning. It was a Toyota dealership service center, which I know sounds like an odd first stop for a Honda, but it was the closest thing to us, and I figured a dealership service center meant qualified technicians. The service advisor took my keys, plugged in a diagnostic computer, drove it around the block, and came back with a clipboard and an expression that I was going to see 4 more times that week. It has that look. That I have bad news and also I'm going to need your credit card look. He told me my transmission was failing, that there was a pressure issue internally, that the solenoids were likely damaged, and that a rebuild would run between $4,500 and $5,500, but given the mileage, a replacement remanufactured unit would be the smarter investment at around $6,000. He suggested I look into financing options. I thanked him and drove away. Not quite believing it, the second place was an independent transmission specialist that had good reviews online. These guys were supposed to be the real deal. People who worked on nothing but transmissions all day long. I drove over there on a Tuesday afternoon, with Maya in the back seat watching something on my old tablet, and I waited for almost an hour in a waiting room that smelled like rubber and old coffee while a technician went over the car. His diagnosis was almost word for word identical to the dealership: failed pressure control solenoid, possible damage to the valve body, fluid contamination, transmission in advanced state of failure. He quoted me $4,200 for a rebuild, but he said there was no guarantee they wouldn't find more damage once they got inside, and the price could go up. I asked if there was any chance it was something simpler, something cheaper, and he looked at me with genuine sympathy, which almost made it worse, and said, "I wish I could tell you yes, man, The third and fourth places I visited that same week were a Honda dealership and a national chain shop, and I will spare you the details because they were almost perfectly identical experiences. One wanted $5,800. One quoted me $4,200 but had a 2-week wait and a long list of conditions and disclaimers. All four of them said essentially the same thing. The transmission was dying, it was just a matter of how fast, and the only real question was how much money I wanted to spend fixing it. By this point I had driven the car gently and nervously for about 10 days, scared of every gear change, and I had been on the phone with my mother twice trying to explain the situation without sounding as panicked as I felt. My mother, bless her heart, offered to lend me $1,000, which I appreciated enormously but which was about a fifth of what any of these places wanted. The fifth place was a Honda specialty shop about 20 minutes away that a coworker had mentioned. I drove out there on a Thursday morning before my shift, and the mechanic there, a guy with 20-something years working specifically on Hondas, took one look at the diagnostic readout and gave me the same verdict. He was actually the most detailed of all of them, walked me through every code, explained exactly what each sensor was reading, and what mechanical failures those readings typically indicated. He was not unkind. He was not trying to take advantage of me. He genuinely believed what he was telling me. But he still quoted me $4,800 and said I should get it done sooner rather than later, because driving it in this condition risked damaging other components. 5 mechanics, 5 different shops, 5 different price points, but one unanimous conclusion. The transmission was gone. I went home that Thursday night, put Maya to bed, and then I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and I tried to figure out the math. Even the cheapest option was more than I had in my checking and savings accounts combined at that moment. The alternatives were equally grim. A new car payment on top of my existing bills would probably break me. Not having a car in a city where public transit was a polite fiction would mean losing one of my jobs, which would then cascade into everything else. I had been sitting there for maybe an hour when my phone buzzed with a text from a guy I knew named Tony, who I had grown up with and who still lived in the neighborhood where we were both raised. Tony was not a mechanic. He was a high school art teacher. But he had texted me because apparently he had mentioned my situation to someone, and that someone wanted me to call a man named Frank. Tony's text described Frank as this old dude who works on cars out of his garage on Delmar Street and knows things other mechanics don't. I will be honest with you. My first reaction was skepticism so deep it bordered on dismissal. I had just spent a week being told the same thing by 5 credentialed professionals. What was some guy in a garage on Delmar Street going to tell me that they had missed? But then I looked at my legal pad with its depressing columns of numbers and I thought, what exactly do I have to lose? A phone call costs me nothing, so I called. Frank picked up on the third ring. He had a voice like someone who had spent 60 years being completely unbothered by things other people found stressful. Deep, unhurried, almost musical in its flatness. I explained my situation. He asked me what codes had been thrown. I read them to him off my phone where I had photographed the diagnostic printouts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When did you last change your transmission fluid?" And I said I wasn't sure, that it had been done at some point before I bought the car, but I didn't have records for it. He said, and have any of these places pulled the pan and looked at the fluid?" I told him no, that as far as I could tell they had run diagnostics and gone on their computers and driven it around the block. He said, "Bring it by Saturday morning. I want to look at it." Just like that. No promises, no estimates, no clipboard. And this is the moment I want you to sit with for a second. Because this is where the story turns. And before I tell you what happened when I pulled up to Frank's garage on that Saturday morning, I want you to pause and really think about what you would have done in my position. 5 experts had told me the transmission was dead. I had a friend vouching for a stranger. My daughter was watching me navigate what felt like an impossible situation. Would you have kept calling banks, trying to figure out financing? Would you have started looking at used cars even though you couldn't afford them either? Or would you have pulled up to the address Tony sent you, on a street you didn't know, to meet a man you'd never seen, in a garage that you had no reason to trust? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know what you would have done, because what happened next is something I am still not sure I fully understand, even though I watched it happen with my own eyes. Saturday morning, early October, cold and gray, I pulled up to Delmar Street with Maya in the back seat because it was my day with her and I had nobody to leave her with. The garage was exactly what you would expect from the words, "Old Man's Garage on Delmar Street." It was attached to a small house that had clearly been well loved for a very long time. The paint was faded but the gutters were straight, and there were pots of still blooming flowers along the front walk that someone had clearly tended carefully. The garage itself was 2 bays, one of them open, and it was absolutely packed with tools, parts, equipment, manuals, and various automotive items in a way that suggested not chaos but a very specific and personal organizational system that only made sense to one person. There was an old Snap-on toolbox against one wall that was taller than me. There were several completed projects in various states of reassembly around the perimeter, and in the center of it all was Frank. Frank was 71 years old. I found this out later. He was a small man, maybe 5'7", with close-cropped white hair and hands that were permanently stained with the kind of grease that doesn't fully wash out after decades of work. He was wearing a blue coverall over a flannel shirt and he was holding a cup of coffee when I pulled in. Maya got out of the car and immediately noticed a large orange cat sitting on a shelf near the workbench, and she asked Frank what the cat's name was, and Frank said, without missing a beat, Torque, and Maya said, "That's a good name," and Frank said, "I know." And I liked him immediately, which I hadn't expected. He asked me to pull the car into the open bay. He walked around it once without saying anything. Then he got in, started it, listened to it idle for about 2 minutes without touching anything, just listening. He revved it gently a couple of times. Then he got out, popped the hood, checked the transmission fluid level and color, and his face did something I had not seen on any of the other mechanics' faces. He looked interested, not concerned. "Interested," he said. "This fluid is dark but it hasn't burned. There's a difference." I didn't know what that meant but I said okay. He said, "I'm going to pull the pan. You can wait inside. My wife Esther makes coffee that's better than anything you'll get anywhere else in this city." And he said it completely without irony. I went inside with Maya, who was still talking about Torque the cat. Esther was a small, energetic woman who gave Maya a glass of juice and a coloring book that she seemed to just produce from thin air like a grandmother's magic trick, and she poured me coffee that was, genuinely, extraordinary. We sat at their kitchen table, and I could hear Frank working in the garage, the occasional clank and rattle, and after about 45 minutes he appeared in the kitchen doorway, with his hands on a paper towel, and he said, "Come look at this." I followed him out to the garage. The transmission pan was off. He had the fluid in a clear container on his workbench and he was holding a small flashlight over it, and he pointed to what was at the bottom. "See this? This is metallic debris, but look at the size of it. These are not clutch pack particles. These are not the kind of catastrophic shearing you get from internal failure. What you have here is a clogged solenoid and a valve body that's got buildup from old fluid. Whoever owned this car before you let the fluid go way too long, and it gummed up the works." I stared at him. I said, "So the transmission isn't dead," he said. "The transmission isn't dead. It's clogged and it's dirty and it's been running bad fluid through it for probably 80,000 miles. But the core unit is fine. The planetary gears are fine. The clutch packs have life in them. What this car needs is a deep fluid flush, a solenoid cleaning, and probably a new filter, and I'd bet you $100 it'll shift like a different car." I stood there for what felt like a long time. I thought about the 5 mechanics, the 5 clipboards, the 5 prices ranging from $4,000 to $6,000. I thought about the diagnostic computers and the technical language and the professional certainty. And I thought about this 71-year-old man in a garage on Delmar Street who had pulled a pan and looked at the actual fluid and reached a completely different conclusion in 45 minutes. I said, "How much?" He said, "Parts and my time, $180, maybe $200, $180. Against $6,000. Frank had started working on cars when he was 14 years old in his uncle's shop. He had spent 30 years as a master technician at a dealership before retiring. And he had kept the garage not because he needed the money, but because he loved it. He told me this while he worked, unhurriedly, systematically, while Maya sat on an overturned milk crate nearby and fed Torque small pieces of the cat treats Esther had brought out in a little dish. He talked about how the rise of computerized diagnostics had changed the industry, how young technicians were trained to trust the codes above all else, and how codes could tell you what a sensor was reading, but not always why. He talked about the importance of actually looking at things, at fluid, at wear patterns, at the physical evidence of how a machine had been living. He said, "A computer tells you what, only experience tells you why, and why is usually a lot cheaper to fix than what." He changed the filter. He flushed the fluid completely with a machine he had built himself, partially from components he had sourced over the years, which he described matter-of-factly as if everyone had one. He cleaned the solenoids with a solvent and compressed air. He reinstalled everything, put in fresh fluid, and then asked me to start the car. I did. He listened to it idle. He had me put it in drive. He had me put it in reverse. He put it in park. He said, take it out, drive it around the block, come back and tell me what you notice. I drove it around the block. The transmission shifted. Cleanly, smoothly. Like it had never been sick a day in its life. I went around a second time because I could not quite believe what I was feeling. I pulled back into the bay. I looked at Frank. He was holding his coffee cup and watching me with that unbothered expression. I said, it shifted perfectly. He nodded like he had expected nothing else. I said, every single mechanic I talked to this week told me the transmission was dead. He nodded again. He said, I know, some of them were guessing. Some of them were reading codes without looking under the car. And some of them, I don't know, maybe they just needed the work. He didn't say it with bitterness. Just with the weary matter-of-factness of a man who had seen this pattern many times over many decades. I paid him $192. He had written it up on a handwritten invoice in a small notepad he pulled from his breast pocket. He refused to charge me more than his actual time and the cost of parts. Maya shook his hand very formally and told him Torque was a good cat, and that she hoped he had a nice day, and Frank said very seriously that he also hoped she had a nice day. Esther came out with a foil-covered plate of something that turned out to be lemon bars and insisted we take them. I sat in the driveway for a moment before pulling out, and I am not too proud to tell you that my eyes were stinging a little bit. The aftermath of all of this is something that has stayed with me ever since. In the weeks following Frank's intervention, I started telling everyone I knew about what had happened. Not just the practical outcome but the thing underneath it. The lesson about expertise and experience and the difference between reading a screen and understanding a machine. About the value of someone who does something because they love it, versus someone who does it because there is money in it. Several of my friends ended up taking their cars to Frank. One of them had been told he needed new brake calipers on both front wheels. Frank found that the caliper slides were simply seized from corrosion and freed them up with penetrating oil and new hardware for $60. Another friend had been quoted $1,200 to replace a fuel pump. Frank traced the problem to a corroded connector at the fuel pump relay and fixed it for the cost of the connector and a half hour of his time. Frank was not magical. He was not performing miracles. He was doing something more remarkable and more rare than that. He was paying attention. I still take my car to Frank. We have become something approaching friends in the way that you can become friends with someone who is much older and much wiser than you, and who has absolutely no reason to spend time on you but does anyway. He comes to Maya's school events sometimes, him and Esther both, because Maya invited them and they said yes. My daughter calls him Uncle Frank, which he pretends to be embarrassed by and clearly loves. Torque is still in the garage, still sitting on that shelf, still deeply unimpressed by everything. What I took away from this whole beyond the immediate relief and the money I didn't have to spend, was something harder to articulate but more important. We live in a world that has decided credentials and technology are always superior to experience and intuition. We have decided that the machine that gives you a printout is more reliable than the man who puts his hands on the thing and looks at it carefully. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes the technology is right and the old knowledge is outdated. But sometimes in transmissions and in life, the most valuable thing anyone can offer you is the patience to actually look. To not assume the worst before you've eliminated the simpler explanations. To trust what you can see and feel and smell over what a screen is telling you, or what 5 other people already decided. I almost lost $4,000 to $6,000 I didn't have. I almost went into debt that would have taken me years to escape. I almost did it because I assumed that consensus was the same thing as truth. Frank taught me it isn't. And $192 and a plate of Esther's lemon bars taught me something I will spend the rest of my life trying to pass on to Maya, which is that wisdom is not the same as credentials, experience is not the same as technology, and the person most worth trusting is often the one who is least interested in impressing you. If this story hit you the way it still hits me when I think about it, go ahead and like this video. I want to know if you were on my side. If you would have gone to Frank's garage. If you believe we have something to learn from people who have forgotten more about their craft than most people will ever know. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Real stories about real moments where the unexpected thing turned out to be the right thing. And leave me a comment with your thoughts on this whole situation. whether it makes you think about who you trust with the important things in your life, and what Uncle Frank's story means to you. I read every single one. I'll see you all in the next story.